So I was doing some work for a client a while back. John, they said, we need you to build out this new feature on an existing web application. It needs to have an initial render state, and then it needs to fetch for data. Depending on what comes back, it should be rendered this way or that way. And what they had at the time was basically ancient jQuery spaghetti code. Now, I could have used jQuery and built what they needed, but especially as things got more and more complex, it would have been more and more of a headache to deal with. Instead, what I did was create a React component that was injected onto their site, and all of its functionality was self-contained. Given that the last episode was about creating our own front-end build process, I thought it would be a good opportunity to kind of share that knowledge and discuss how you can add React to an existing web application without the overhead and size and complexity of the Create React app. Now, don't get me wrong, the Create React app is great, but if you need to change anything about the build process, things can get messy quickly. Now, if you do find anything in this video useful, feel free to subscribe for more content like this. Likes and comments also help grow the channel. Let's get started. Alright, now as always, I'm going to put the content of this lesson up on GitHub. I'll throw a link in the description. If you didn't see the last episode, it might be helpful. It's certainly not needed if you already understand how Webpack works and have a general idea of a standard front-end build. But nevertheless, feel free to check it out. So the point we're at right now is that we have this webpack.config.js. It's handling our JavaScript as well as our styling, giving us SCSS. If we take a look at our package.json, we see that we have both a dev build and a production build. So to start things off, I'm going to run npm run dev. And with that, we can get started. So the three new dependencies that we're going to need to add for this are React, React DOM, and then Babel preset React. So I can copy that. We'll stop this and then just say npm I for install. That was React, React DOM, and Babel preset React. Next, we're going to update our Webpack config to include that React preset. And so that's very simple. Where we have our presets option here, we just have to add that in right there. So then we can get this running again with npm run dev, and that looks good. Next, we're going to create a React file for our test. So I've already created a React directory in our JS directory, and that includes files for component 1 and component 2, because we're going to end up making 2 today. So it's also worth noting, if you were to create just one single component and that's all you needed to inject into the site, you probably would just add the app.js right inside of this React directory, because that's going to house then all of your subcomponents. In our case, we're going with the idea that we have two different parts of the site that are separate from each other, and they need different features. Now, maybe those features need to communicate somehow, and we can look at that later. But for now, we just need to be able to render two separate components in two separate places on the site. And so because of that, I created component 1, and then we're going to say new file, and we'll say app1.js. And now if you're familiar with React, we're just going to create a standard component. If you're not familiar, it's not too complicated. We are going to import React from React. and then I'll say const app1 is set to, and we're just going to create an arrow function here that is going to return a div, and at the end we're just going to export default, and we're going to export that component. And now for the sake of just having something there, let's just create h6, and this is going to be our counter. So we can save that up. But if we go to our page and refresh, we're going to see nothing's changed. And the main reason for that is that we have to actually inject this component now into our site. And we're going to do that in our second.js file, which is imported by our index.js and then run here. And this probably doesn't even need to be console log run it. We can just run it. And that's not necessary either. So we'll save that up. Second.js. Now what I'm going to do just for the sake of organization is create a function and say render counter. If we look at our build.html, we see that where that first component is button.app. So we'll take that and we're going to create a constant variable wrapper, and that is going to be set to document.getElementById button app. Then we're just going to say if that wrapper exists, render our component. Now, in order to do this, we'll need to import three different things. We need to import our standard React, import React DOM from React DOM, and then we need to import our app1 from React comp1 app1, like that. Then what we can do is just say React DOM.render, and that's going to take two arguments. The first is what we want to render, and the second argument is where we want to render it. And now because we have that React preset, what we're able to do is use JSX inside of this file. So we can just say app1 like that. And then we'll add the location as the wrapper. And just to make sure that that gets run, we'll say console.log rendering render counter. And then down here, we're going to call it. Oops. And then the only thing I forgot to do is include this /. Reload that, and boom, we have our counter. Before we do anything else, I might as well just create our button here. That says, press me, and do some fun React stuff. So on click, console.log pressed. Return there, and we see that that's working. So if you just wanted to see how you can add a React component to an existing site, then look no further. It wasn't too difficult. It was pretty simple. But what I want to do is go a step further and show how you can actually get those different components to communicate, because that gives you an extreme amount of flexibility then, where if you need different parts of the site to know what the other's doing, but you don't have the luxury of getting to build out the whole app from scratch, this is going to help you accomplish that. And what we're going to use for that is called MobX. One of the biggest methods for global state management handling is called Redux, which I've just never liked. I've always thought it was overly complicated, especially when you compare it to something like MobX. It's extremely simple and requires a lot less boilerplate code. So that's what we're going to do here. And the idea I had was just have a button that counts, and then we'll have a different component that's actually going to act as the label. So the first thing I'm going to do is handle all of our imports. And so npm install MobX. And if you're using this within an existing React app, you'll also want to install MobX-React, which I don't think I'll need today, but we'll see. I might end up having to import that in a little bit. But that installed, so let's run our dev environment again. And then actually before we go any further, let's create this second component. So I'll just copy all of that, create a new file, and call that app2.js. And that is app2. And what we'll do here is say at, and this is where we'll use props. So we'll say props.count. If that exists, then display props.count. Otherwise, display NA. Next, let's go back to the second.js. We can pretty much copy this and say render label. We're going to need our label app as the ID. And this will be app2 from comp2 app2. Rendering label. And then finally, app2. Last thing we need to do is just render this label. Save that up, refresh, and we see at not available because we haven't passed a value yet. Now, just to show how this works, just as we would use any component in a standard React app, we can add props to this component. So we can say count is set to 1. And if we refresh that, it's going to say 1. One thing I just thought of that we're actually going to want to handle for is in this app2, we're saying if count is false, if it registers as false, then don't say count. And so what I'm going to do is throw this down and say if type of props.count is equal to a number, then display it, otherwise say NA. So that way we're just going to say if we actually were given a number. And now just to demonstrate that, if we go back to our second.js and set that to 0, even though that would have registered as false, we get 0 here, which is what we want. And so now what we want to do is every time that values clicked, we want to track that counting value and let the other one know. And that's where MobX comes in. What MobX does is it gives us the ability to create what are called stores. And so I just took this from their website as an example. I added count, but I'm going to call this our count store. And so the way this generally works is you have things that are called observables, where it does what it sounds like. It observes it. And when it observes it, then you can tell React to watch this store and re-render when it changes. So what I can do is pass that store, count store, to our render counter. And actually, instead of passing count, we'll just pass a store to our second app. So we'll say count store. And so this is actually where I think I'm going to end up needing to import that second MobX library. So I'll say npm I, and that's going to be MobX React. And what that's essentially going to do is include another function that I'll be able to use with React to tell it to observe the store. So that got updated. And so what I'm going to do here is import observe from MobX React. And then I just say observe this app1, and that should work. And so here we can just say props.store .count, I think I called it. Yep, .count plus. And actually, this bit of code, we're never going to be re-rendering for this component. So actually, I'm going to move that over to our second app. So observe, and then here, you can take that out as well. And just observe this component. And here, this will be store.count, props.store.count. And so if I go up here, it's yelling at me for using a class here because that's not supported based on whatever presets I'm using right now. So what I'm just going to do is create let count store and just create this as an object. This should actually be count. And then just the final thing we're going to do is this needs to actually be observer. So observer, and just to clean everything up. Get that all saved up. Refresh. And there we go. So we've got the counter that's telling the store to update that count. And whenever it gets updated, our second component, the label, is actually being told to re-render. Now, obviously, this might look extremely simple, and it is a very basic functionality when you really break it down. But it's also extremely powerful. If you think about the implications of this, so this gives you the ability to have two separate components that might have other old code in between, but those new components are still able to communicate. So admittedly, that is probably more of a fringe case. But nevertheless, for how few lines of code it actually took to get this done, I think it's something that's definitely worth at least playing around with. So a final overview of the code shows we're including a store that's going to store our values that we want to keep track of. We're then rendering one of our components another and running those functions that get that done. And then our two components are both self-contained in their own files. We had to target specific divs for each component, and in order to use JSX and React and all of that, we're including our Babel / preset React into our presets. So I hope that made sense. I hope you followed it. I definitely encourage you to play around with this stuff. Like I said before, you can get this on my GitHub. The link is going to be in the description. And if you haven't touched React before, it may make more sense to play around with the Create React app. Just because so many things are done for you, it allows you to just focus on the React side of things. But if you're curious about adding React to an existing project that you don't want to rewrite from scratch, this might be the key to your success. So again, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe to help grow the channel, and have a good day. Thanks.